Today on Money Matters, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve, and to help answer our questions today, Shirley Benedict is with us. Shirley, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Shirley, could you give us a little history on the Federal Reserve? When was it started and why was it started?
The Federal Reserve System was created in December of 1913 when President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. Prior to this being founded, the nation was plagued with financial crises. At times, these crises led to panics where people would race to the banks and withdraw all their deposits. A particularly severe panic in 1907 resulted in the banks run that wreaked havoc on the fragile banking system and ultimately led Congress to write this Federal Reserve Act. And it's composed of the central independent government agency known as the Board of Governors, of which Janet Yellen is now the recently appointed chair. Of course, she was appointed by President Barack Obama and had to be approved by Congress. It is also comprised of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which are in major cities throughout the nation. Winona is part of the 9th District, which is in Minneapolis. We refer to that as the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis.
So who owns the Federal Reserve? It sounds like it may be owned by the government.
The Federal Reserve banks are actually part of the federal government. Well, actually, they're not part of the federal government. The only part of the federal government is the Board of Governors because it's an act of Congress. The actual Federal Reserve banks are privately owned. Member banks own stock, and actually they make their money off the fees that the member banks pay them. So they truly are a private corporation.
What exactly does the Federal Reserve do, Shirley? What are some of their responsibilities?
Their main responsibility is that they're the banker's bank. They are a bank to the banks just like we are a bank to our customers. They lend money to banks. They process electronic payments. They actually provide the coin and currency to banks. And one of the big things is they do processing of checks. Years ago, I shouldn't say years ago, but they actually, at the end of every day, you sent all your physical checks to the Federal Reserve Bank. We, of course, sent them to Minneapolis, and then they would distribute them throughout the other Federal Reserve banks so the banks could get paid for their checks that customers had written. Of course, with the Check 21, that actually converted all those checks to electronic images, and so now all those checks are just processed at one of the Federal Reserve banks rather than all 12 of the Federal Reserve banks. Another thing that they do is they maintain the accounts of the U.S. Treasury. They process the government checks. You know, if you get a tax return, that's processed by the Federal Reserve. Your Social Security checks are processed by the Federal Reserve. And they conduct government security auctions. The Fed is also set up with a variety of targets, which are the amount of money that circulates in the economy, the level of reserves held by banks. There's a specific amount that each bank has to hold as a deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank, and the level of interest rates. The Fed constantly measures the effects of its policies on the economy.
Where does the funding come to operate the Federal Reserve? Is that through tax dollars?
No, it's not really funded with tax dollars. However, the fees for the services that the U.S. government uses, you know, for the U.S. Treasury account, would therefore, the U.S. government would have to pay them the fees for that. But it's set up like a private corporation, as I said, and so the member banks hold stock and they pay fees.
So then who audits the Federal Reserve?
It's actually, each Federal Reserve Bank is audited annually by an independent auditor. In addition to that, they are held accountable for many things, including the chair of the Board of Governors has to report regularly to Congress. The president of each reserve bank is chosen by a local board, but then has to be approved by the Board of Governors. And the budget of each reserve bank also has to be approved by the Board of Governors.
Well, Shirley, thank you so much for taking some time to shed some light on the Federal Reserve. It was very interesting.
Thank you.